champions. Our chats program is made possible by a generous sponsorship from the First Bank. So if you're in there depositing your riches, say thank you for this program. They've sponsored it for years. And just a quick mention of an upcoming chats that we have this Saturday. It's unusual for us to do a chats this Saturday, but Jenna Russell and Scott Hellman are reporters for the Boston Globe. And they are the reporters reporting on the Boston Marathon bombing case and punishment phase. And they will be here this Saturday to talk about that. It's at Lincoln Theater. We're expecting a big crowd, and it starts at 11 o'clock. But let's get to why we're here today. Andy Hubbard was born and raised in a small fishing village on the coast of Maine, and he graduated from Lincoln Academy. There, he was president of the Haynes Science Club, president of the National Honor Society, and captain of the math team. He attended Dartmouth College and graduated magna cum laude, receiving awards in creative writing and psychology and a degree in English. He completed his formal education at Columbia University, receiving a Master of Fine Arts degree in creative writing, summa cum laude. For most of his career, he worked as the director of training for a number of major financial institutions. He is a well-known speaker on the topic of corporate training and has authored 3 books and dozens of articles on the subject. He is a former martial artist and competitive weightlifter, a casual student of cooking and wine, a gemologist, a collector of edged weapons, a licensed handgun instructor, and an avid outdoor photographer. He currently lives in rural Indiana with his wife, 2 Siberian Huskies, and a demon cat. Please welcome Andy Hubbard.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me, Andy, could you just move in a little bit towards the middle? Thanks.
Is that better?
Yeah, that's much better.
Okay. If I don't move around too much, it's because I don't want to go off camera. Thank you very much for the introduction. It didn't always live as exciting as it reads, but a lot of the time it was looking for a job, trying to keep food on the table. What I should have written into that biography, which I did for my publisher, was that I also have 3 kids, and they will all speak to me. And this is an accomplishment which those of you who are parents understand. For a short period of time, I was able to say I have 3 teenagers, and they will all speak to me. Then one of them turned 20. But that is kind of an achievement, and the older I get, the more I glory in my children, and watching them go through the dance of their own lives. This morning, I have an hour, and Pam has prepped me that I should probably read and talk for 30 to 40 minutes, leave about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for questions. That's the best part, okay? And please do not hold your questions. If something comes up that interests you or you have a question about, please stop me. I've spent the last day and a quarter at Lincoln Academy working with some English classes, and the best part is when they say, prove it, or what did you do that for, or what are your views on this or that, or why did you write this poem, and that kind of thing. So I thrive on that. Please challenge me with hard questions if you wish. People tend to be nice to a presenter they don't know too well. No need to be nice to me. The more challenging questions, probably the more entertaining it will be for all of you. I don't bleed easily, okay? And I'll talk a little bit about the book that I recently had published and read a few poems from it, and then move on to some poems I've written more recently. The background is that I have written poetry for many, 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 many years. And I've never stopped, although I've slowed down a lot during most of my career in the working world and as a husband and a father. And the reason is just a matter of time. You know, if you go to work at 7:30 in the morning and you get home at 6:30 at night, and the lawn needs to be mowed, the garbage needs to be taken out, and the dinner needs to be cooked, and the kids want help with their homework, that's it. There's just really not much time for much else. And then about 5 years ago, actually, I started working harder at promoting myself as a poet. And what you have to do, one of the things you have to do is find a publisher, and that's very, very difficult. basically, publishers publish to make money. And basically, they don't want to work with authors who do not have an agent. And agents will not handle poets because poets never make a dime. So, don't laugh. I still have bills to pay. So, poetry in America generally does not get published much. And that's one of the reasons why most people in America are not engaged in poetry, really. And there's another reason, which really will not bear the light of day, but I'm going to say it anyway, and I apologize to anyone if I shouldn't. And that is, when I found out about 2 years ago that I was going to have a book published, I started force-feeding myself contemporary poetry, because the poetry that I have chosen to read most of my adult life is by people who are all dead. And I thought, if I'm going to really make this my new profession, I better know what's going on out there. Who are my competitors? Who are my colleagues? Who can I look up to? And I've read probably at least a book a week of poetry for the last year and a half by people who are writing now and publishing now. And I haven't found any, really, that I like in America. I've refound, I think, the greatest poet of the last 100 years, and he happens to be from India, and his name is Rabindranath Tagore. And I've also found a couple of other poets that I admire very much. One is named Yehuda Amichai, if I'm pronouncing it right, he's Israeli. And another is Pablo Neruda from Chile, who is better known. And other places in the world poets have a higher esteem and more of a following than in America. And one of the reasons is the publishing problem that I mentioned. The other is the one that I just alluded to, which is when I really dig into what's being written today in America, I don't think much of it. That's the other reason why people don't read poetry, is because it sucks. And I think that's a fine reason. But then the second reason loops back to the first reason, which is if you can't make a living writing poetry, and out of 300 million Americans, not one person can, and you don't have a following, you're much more likely to get the chicks playing guitar than writing poetry. And so why would it attract talented young people? And the answer is it doesn't seem to much. And that's too bad. I think, let's say for the sake of argument that I'm the 8th best poet in America. If I were the 8th best basketball player, I'd be worth $15 million a year. If I'm the 8th best poet, I'm not worth a dime. And I still want to eat every day. So this is a problem. But anyway, the reason that I stuck to poetry and just persevered at it is unknown to living men. I don't know why, I just did. And about 3 or 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I had a stern talk with myself and said, if you think you're so good, you're going to have to do something, because it's not going to come to you. So I started approaching publishers, and I did that for 3 years before I found a publisher who would take a chance on an unknown, scarcely published poet. And my publisher is a company called Interactive Press, and kind of interestingly, they're in Queensland, Australia. That's how far I had to go to find someone who would take a chance on me. And one of the things about it that interests me is my favorite poet is Robert Frost. And Robert Frost had to go to England to get published early in his career. So I feel like kind of a kinship with the guy I most admire that I had to go to Australia. But anyway, about a year and a quarter ago or so, the book came out. And I'll talk about it a little bit and read a few poems from it, and then get into some newer stuff. Unless anyone has a question already or something they'd like to say or a comment.
I have a comment.
Yes, sir.
I've been introduced to poetry, or reintroduced to poetry, which I found excruciatingly boring in high school.
Yes.
But reintroduced to it by Garrison Keillor's program on NPR, which daily just rolls out a whole new poem, and I find at least one, if not two a week, that I'm just taken with, whether they're contemporary or, or back to Shakespeare. It's been it's been exciting to listen to all these poets that I've had no idea existed.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And I'm another one, and I hope you'll say that about me.
Okay.
And I've heard nothing but good things about him and his show. I'm not personally acquainted with it.
Okay.
And my answer to that is I just can't read everything.
Okay.
And I'm going to make a point to become acquainted with the stuff he does, because I've heard many people bring it up in a very positive way.
Yeah, it's the Writer's Almanac.
Writer's Almanac.
Yeah.
9 o'clock.
Yep, 9 o'clock every
Public
morning.
radio. And
Yep.
it's
Okay,
3 minutes.
Yep.
great, great. All right. I'm going to read a few poems from this book, not a whole lot. Incidentally, I did the photography for the front and back covers. Photography is another one of my hobbies, and what I chose for a cover photograph is my favorite place in America, which is Rocky Mountain National Park. Should you have the opportunity, don't miss it. It doesn't have quite the grandeur of Yosemite, but it's not far short, and it's a lot less known. So it's a good place to go.
Could you hold it up? Hold it up so we can get a shot of it. Okay, thank you.
And the one on the back cover you can hardly see, but it's another one of our favorite places. When our kids were little, we would do a lot of mini vacations to Cumberland Falls State Park in Kentucky. Kentucky's a beautiful state, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to read you a poem about that place too. Now, very few of my poems, just tell me if I go off camera.
Yeah.
Very few of my poems are like about something with a capital A, but the one I'm going to read first is. And I chose it as the opening poem for the book on purpose. And the purpose is to invite the reader to take a chance on participating in or believing in some things that are improbable. Okay, some critics somewhere had a beautiful phrase about art saying it involves a willing suspension of disbelief. I can't remember who said that. Do you guys know?
No, I can't remember yet.
And that's kind of what I was getting at in this poem. And it also will help you to know the poem to know that for a while I lived on the western edge of Nebraska. There's not much there, and that's what's appealing about it. And the western edge of Nebraska abuts Wyoming. And the area we lived looked more like Wyoming than Nebraska. And we loved it very much. And one of the things, your trivia for the day, Wyoming has the highest wind, most wind of any state. Local people hate it. I loved it. I loved it. Wyoming rancher said to me once, there's an annoying wind that blows here almost all the time, which cracked me up because I thought it was a beautiful wind. I loved it. Anyway, this poem involves that, and it's called The Squirrel Who Loved Wind Chimes. And it's a little hard to read because it's dialogue, and it's always hard to signify when the speaker changes, but I'll do what I can by shuffling around a little bit. This is a little hard to believe. Nevertheless, the metal chimes hung from an eave outside the sliding glass door of the patio, and when the vagrant Wyoming wind pulsed through with energy to ring them, the squirrel came to participate. How do you know it was because of the chimes? Because when the chimes didn't ring, the squirrel didn't come. How do you know it was the same squirrel? Because he had a white fur scar on his left cheek. What did he do? He'd watch the chimes with the tail of his eye from the patio railing, or sit beneath them with his paws crossed, looking up. But his favorite trick was to cling to the roof edge, right above the chimes, and hang down staring at them with his tail twitching, and then run across the roof with a scratch and clatter, then back to do it again. Once he left an offering, 3 acorns, nosed together right beneath the chimes. Why, do you think? I don't know. I wish I'd seen him do it. No, I mean, why did he like the wind chimes? I've thought about it. I don't know. I think maybe he was a Newton, a Mozart of squirrels, and he heard more than other squirrels, more than we did. And then what happened? He stopped coming. Maybe a hawk had something to do with it, maybe not. But after an interval, I honored him by taking down the chimes. Thank you. And that made me think of another one, which also has dialogue in it. Dialogue's a little hard to write. Few of my poems have dialogue, but when I do it, to tell the truth, I usually like the way it comes out. And this one, my wife liked it particularly because she's in it. Okay? And it was interesting when the book was in production, pre-production. After the publisher agreed to produce the book, he assigned me to an editor, and her job was to weed out, add some, have me edit stuff. And when I found out her age, I got uppity, I got annoyed about it. Because I said, she's like 22. And I'm like, this child is not going to teach me how to write poetry. And then I said, Andy, don't be a snot. Let's see what her work is like. Well, her work was wonderful. It was excellent. We're very close friends now. And about 90% of her suggestions I accepted immediately. About 10% we arm wrestled over. And this is the only poem that's in the book that she would have taken out. And when we had those discussions about this and some other poems, she would say, well, you're the poet, do what you want. And I'd say, well, there's no point having an editor if you don't do what the editor says. So we went back and forth very nicely. And in the end, this poem made the cut. It's still one of my favorites. It's called McDonald's Man. There are a lot more street people than 10 years ago. And this one, in McDonald's, where we went after the play for my wife to get tea, struck me for two reasons. He said, thank you, ma'am, when he got his coffee. And he said it with the nuance we call cultivation. And he put his change in the lucite donation box beside the cash register. Odd. He must have begged hard and swallowed much pride for those $2 wrinkled dollars. He should have gotten protein. He needs protein, I muttered to my wife. Why coffee? It's cold. He's cold, she replied. The line moved ahead. We got her drink. The guy sat hunched under bright lights with a 10-day peppered beard and wisps of white hair askew, moving his lips, avoiding looks, effacing himself. Gripping the coffee with two shaking hands, delicate fingers but dirty, and yellow corrugated nails. We were heading out. I hesitated and took my wife's arm. I want to buy him a sandwich, but I don't know how to ask him. If he doesn't want it, he'll be insulted. But he doesn't look good. I don't know what to do. Just go. I teased, usually you're the softie. He scares me. How can a 60-year-old guy with nothing but a green plastic carry bag scare you? He just does. Let's go. He's just sitting there. You can't live on coffee. I don't care. Let's go. We went. Her feet wrapped in anger against the asphalt. And I know her well enough to know she doesn't know if the anger is for me or her or just a situation.
Andy,
Yeah.
why is that a poem and not an essay?
Because every line starts with a capital letter. It was a smart-ass answer because it was the first one that came to my mind. But I'll tell you a little story, and that is, I was going a month or two ago to Nashville, Indiana High School, spent a day talking, reading to students and stuff. And after all these years of training still, when I have to face an audience, I'm just panic-stricken. And I had to be there at 10, so at 8 o'clock I was dressed and ready and sitting at the kitchen table sweating. And I said, okay, let me try to prepare by thinking what they're going to ask me and trying to prepare some answers. Fortunately, they didn't ask me hard questions. But the hard question I was expecting is, I was expecting them to say, what is a poem? And thank God they didn't. But I wrote a definition of poetry to be ready if they did. And it's going to take me a minute, but I'm going to find it for you and share it with you, if I can. If I can find it in a minute.
I've wanted to ask a poet that question for 20 years.
Well, how about I disappoint you?
Pressure's on.
definition. I wrote it in 5 minutes, and I wrote beside it, I'll probably revise this 25 times. And I never have, because I was happy with it. Poetry is an attempt to communicate thoughts, emotions, stories, or insights in language using the most powerful, precise, and evocative words possible. Okay? Now, I brought some poems by some other people. I don't know if we'll get to them. I think we probably would not. But I brought some poems that I particularly like, and I brought a few poems that I particularly dislike. Or that I have issues of one kind or another with. There is a writer that I like. His name is Bill Holm, H-O-L-M, and he's an Icelandic American, and I like the way he writes. And I have a book of his poems, and some of them look like poems, and some of them don't look like poems. This is one of his poems. It's a poem because it's a book of poetry and it's in it, so it must be a poem. And the question is it a poem? And my answer is no. I say it's not a poem. It's nicely written, it's interesting, it engages me, but I don't think it's a poem. I think it's 2 paragraphs of prose. And since I'm on that particular rant, there's another one. I was mentioning to you, I think, that I recently read a book called The Best American Poems of 2008. This is one of a series of anthologies. And that was the first one I happened upon. I'm going to get more of them. They're very interesting. They're interesting in things I like, and they're interesting in things I don't like. And one of the interesting things, and I'm not sure how I feel about it, is that book, 75 poems, not one rhymes. Interesting. Interesting. And this poem, I had written in the margin, this is the worst title I have ever heard. And I apologize should the poet ever find out that I'm maligning him like this. But here's the title of the poem. If see no end in is. That's it. If see no end in is. And I'm choosing this as an example because of my definition that starts out poetry as an attempt to communicate. To me, this is not an attempt to communicate, it's an attempt to obfuscate. And my reaction is, what is the point? And I don't think there is one. Now, if we do have time, I also brought some of what I consider the best poems ever written. And we probably won't get to them, and I think probably it's just as well, because my gut feeling is that when I'm done here, you folks will say, that's pretty good. And if I read poetry that's a lot better than mine, then you'll say, well, I thought it was pretty good, and you read the good stuff. Now, really bum out.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, please.
On that one, the poem that whose title you just read, If See No.
Yes.
It looked like a very short poem.
It wasn't. It was about 50 lines. I pulled out a stanza in case anybody wanted me to go on with the title. I will. I didn't like the poem. And the second stanza is, new but the same. What none knows is how to change. Each plateau you reach, if single, limited, only itself, includes traces of all the others, so that in the end, limitation frees you. There is no end if you once see what is there to see. If you like it, more power to you.
Andy?
I like zoned out before I could get much farther than that. Yes?
I have a question. What about the role of imagery, visual imagery? Does that work into your poetry, or do you see a value in it?
Yes. I consider it absolutely critical, and I hope you find good visual imagery in my poetry. If you don't, then I failed.
The reason I wondered about it is one of my favorite poems of all time is Allen Ginsberg's Howl,
Yeah.
which is just chock-a-block full of very, very powerful imagery all the way
Yes.
through it, and delivered forcefully, as if you're familiar with it.
Oh, yeah.
And I wondered what your take on that was.
Off the top of my head, I always liked that poem a great deal, And I read a lot more of Allen Ginsberg's poetry, and I never found anything else I liked as much.
Me neither.
I mean, any poet's work is uneven. Even the greatest poets have written some fairly mediocre stuff. But in my experience of Allen Ginsberg, his proportion of good stuff to bad stuff is unfortunately small.
Yeah, I sometimes think of him as a one-trick pony, but it's a really good trick.
That was the phrase that I was going to use, and I decided it was just mean-spirited. I didn't say it. Anything else? Okay. I'm going to have to dig for the next poem. Hang on. I'm not one of those people who multitask very well. We have a special guest. I'm going to find this filter. Okay. Who is Olivia from the Lincoln County News. She interviewed me about an hour ago, and one of her questions was whether there's another book. And the answer is yes, I'm about done with the second book. And what I'm pausing for is to try to figure out how to approach my publisher, since my first book did not make him filthy rich, how to approach him about taking another shot on me for a second book. I haven't figured out exactly how to word that. I'll put on my sales hat, but I have to figure out what to say once I've got it on. I've not yet figured that out. Anyway, I have written the title poem for the next book. I'm pleased with the title, I'm pleased with the image, and frankly, I'm pleased with the poem. It's got country roots, okay? And the poem and the book are called The Divining Rod. And this is it. I promised it to Olivia. The old folks believed in many things we do not, and one was called dowsing, the art of finding where to dig a well. Some few old men had the gift, and for $1 or as a favor, they would walk your property, holding hard the spreading ends of a Y-shaped witch hazel stick, fresh cut and never peeled. And where water perked not far below, the water's will would pull the stick end down and point in place. I saw it once as a little boy. The dowser came to Shepherd's Farm in a rattle-trap 40s Chevy driven by his daughter. I remember he was stooped and thin, with wide faded blue suspenders, flimsy white hair, and high veins on his back hands. He was kind of scared, but he liked little boys and said I could come along. From the car he took his stick, with fresh whittle marks where he trimmed it, and a little cloth bag that went over one shoulder. He called it his medicine. And we walked out and out to a giant field bounded by maples and evergreens. He bowed his head for a long time, rolled up his sleeves, and held his stick's spread legs at arm's length, chest high. He wandered aimlessly, it seemed, around the field, and I followed him for a while. Then I got bored, wandered away, picked some buttercups, wandered back. Nothing continued to happen. The dowser's shirt back had a splotch of sweat, and I was getting hungry. Then he stopped, the veins popped out on his neck, and the point of his stick dove groundward so brutally the bark sprained off, showing the green underbark and pale damp wood beneath. There she did, Rosalba said, and marked the place with 3 stacked stones. Back at the house they gave him a glass of rum, and he dozed in a chair before his daughter took him home. So many years have passed, so many beliefs lost, and so little to replace them. I wonder now how to weigh what we have gained against what we have lost, and what really happened in that sunny summer field. Does water speak? Does God speak through a stick? Is the magic in the stick or in the man? Or does the man believe the stick and not himself? This one's kind of fun and a little lighter and kind of different from anything else that I've written or anything I've read for that matter. one of the privileges of not being rich and successful is I can do anything I want. And this is the only poem I've ever written with no punctuation whatsoever. And it starts with a quote, a prose quote. I think this is called a subscript, I'm not sure, from a Reader's Digest article that I read when I was maybe 10 years old. And it was down there somewhere percolating. And it's pretty close to a quote. And it goes like this. The researchers strewed toys around the room and tiptoed out. They knelt at the keyhole to see which the chimpanzee would choose to play with. When they looked through the keyhole, what they saw was the eye of the chimpanzee. And that's the title of this poem, The Eye of the Chimpanzee. And I probably should explain one other thing. Trying to put myself in the chimpanzee's place, looking at a bunch of people, I think the first thing that I would notice about them is that their arms are all too short. People have these little stubby arms, it's all wrong. Okay? So that explains why the poem begins the way it does. The short arms mean well, clearly. They are gentle and hold my hand, but never hold each other's hands, peculiar. They seem to like to watch me play, and I watch them play, but they don't do much. Do they know how? They want to show me games. I can do them, but they're pointless, except for the grapes they give me. The grapes are very good, and something we can share. I'm alone much of the time, and sit with my back against the bars. I rub my forehead slowly, struggling to form questions in a tangled cloud that sometimes clears just a little bit. What am I? Are there others? I feel that most probably there are others, that I should sleep not alone, but in companionship. Sleep is most difficult. My dreams are shaped like dark mushrooms, ominous and frightening. And when I wake up, I don't know what is real. One of my quarrels, I think one of my biggest quarrels with contemporary poetry is the stuff that I have read over the past year or two is completely and utterly lacking in wit. Now, poems are not jokes, and there aren't many poems that would make you crack up, but a little wit is a good thing. A little lightness, it helps to, in my opinion, leaven the poem, and if you're not really into poetry, it makes it less unpleasant and more bearable. And I'm going to read one or two poems where I like to think there is a little bit of wit involved. And this is one of them. And I'm reading this for another reason too, and that is I'm a huge believer in compression, trying to take a poem and just squeeze it down and down and down, more and more. And I truly believe that most of the time. Sometimes for the voice of a particular poem, I'll let it ramble a little bit, just because I'm not rich and famous, I can do whatever I want. And this poem, I like to call it chatty rather than too wordy. And this poem meanders a little bit like that. And it's called The Coal Train. And it's got a little subscript of where this is happening. And it's McGraw, Nebraska. When I would drive by the small tilted sign, McGraw, Nebraska, Pot 99, I'd always mutter, would somebody please have a baby? I'd park, climb the tall bluff beside Chimney Rock, and sit with my beer and sandwich, looking out over the endless sweep of high plains. It was a good place, spiritual but not demanding. Sometimes there was great heat, and sunlight blending off farm machinery, raising roiled dust clouds miles away. Often I could watch scattered cloud shadows racing across the ground. And if I was lucky, there might be a mile-long black train, so far away it was silent, pulling its 100 open cars of crushed coal deliberately from the enormous open pit mines of Wyoming to power the factories and brighten the nights back east. I did some math one rainy afternoon, X tons of coal per car, times 100 cars per train, times 3 or 4 trains per day, times 365 days per year, times lots of years. It seemed so much coal had freighted out of Wyoming, It should disrupt the Earth's rotation, make us wobble off track. And maybe it has. Maybe coal's the explanation for the nightly litany of horrors flying in nervous procession across the TV news screen. The tanks clawing their uneven way across the rubble they created. Good guys or bad guys with their cheap, efficient Kalashnikovs, murdering their neighbors and bulldozing the bodies into trenches. Apathetic children, too weak to brush off the flies. Yes, I'm pretty sure we should blame the coal. Those Permian conifers had an evil streak. That makes more sense than anything I get from the spotless, overgroomed, accent-free, script-reading automaton analysts the networks roll out at 5-minute intervals. Yes, I've got the goods. It's not the Russians or the Americans, not the Congolese with their machetes, not the Taliban or Hezbollah. It's the fascist vibes from the Carboniferous era. Call it the Wyoming Wall. All I need to do is figure out how to break the news so all the credit stays with me. I'm thinking Nobel Prize.
Andy, I have a question.
Yeah.
How'd you get from Newcastle to Nebraska?
Desperation, really.
And Nebraska's what you chose?
No, Nebraska chose me. What happened is, in my working life, I did two things wrong. I picked the wrong career and I did it in the wrong industry. By career, I'm a training manager. And the industry I worked in was mortgage banking, which is notoriously volatile. Companies are always going bankrupt, going out of business, merging, laying off, whatever. And for decades, I basically lost a job every 3 or 4 years. And what happened is, my gosh, I didn't lose a job that time. I was in Charlotte, North Carolina, very nice city. And I had been a training director at that point for 10 or 15 years. And the next logical step up would be a human resources director. Because in most organizations, training is part of human resources. I found a company in Nebraska and Colorado that would take a chance on me as human resources director. More normally, a human resources director is pulled from compensation or from personnel, two other fields that pyramid up into human resources. Training's kind of an orphan stepchild. But that's what took me to Nebraska. And then, of course, 3 years later, that company went out of business. And then I prepared 2 resumes, one time in my life, human resources director or training director. And the job I found was training director in Indianapolis, which is what took me to Indiana the first time. Okay? Now this is one of the most recent ones, and once again, I like to think this has a little tiny bit of wit. But I'm choosing this one to read when I have very little time left, because I like it. That's all. It's called Crow Song. And it was written in the dead of last winter. We had a tough winter in Indiana. You had a worse one in Maine. But it gets cold in Indiana. We had a few days below 0. These 0 mornings, the dry snow squeaks beneath our boots, and the sun is a wan apology in the east. We share our simple abundance, putting out seed and cracked corn for the neighborly birds. They twitter and peck, grab and gulp, fly off in a frenzy, fly back for more. It's a party, until the T-Rex of local birds alights to take his mighty and royal due. A crow so huge, so stately and severe, he scares my daughter. I slip outside with a camera, but he senses me, and is off fast and low and silently, until he is out of sight. And then he erupts, cawing in derision. I stole your seeds. I stole your corn. I stole them, and you can't catch me. Ha! He's so thrilled with the theft. Why tell him it was a gift?
Andy,
Yes.
question. Do you do poetry slams, or do you have any thoughts about doing that? Or
I don't know what it is.
a poetry slam? It's usually held in a cafe. I've yet to actually go to one, but I hear they're pretty popular, and people get up and will just read their poetry, and I guess there's you're really inviting criticism or praise, but it's kind of a gutsy thing to do.
Yeah, I'm going to. I live nowhere, but if you go 15 miles west of there is the town of Bloomington, Indiana, which is a college town and surprisingly well known for a fairly small town. I was interviewed for an article not about poetry not long ago, and the guy who interviewed me referred me to someone who is the chairman of the Writers Guild of Bloomington. And reluctantly, I joined, and now I get their weekly newsletter, and yeah, they have open mic nights and things, and I'm going to do it.
Sounds like fun.
How about if I give you the poems and you do it? I'm selecting this one because it made my daughter cry, okay? I took that as quite the compliment. A tearjerker. And one of the questions I get most often, I got pummeled with this at Lincoln Academy the last day or so, is, did that really happen? And I won't answer in most cases. But I'll volunteer this time. This particular one is absolutely and completely true. Okay? They're all true if they're a good story. And in some cases, they're true in the abstract, external sense of the word. And in some cases, they're not. And that's my secret. Okay? This one's called 20 Feet of Chain. The dog next door lives on a chain, 20 feet long, attached to an iron staple near the door of the barn. He can go in and out, and they are scrupulous about giving him water and food, but they never wanted a dog. He was dumped on them by a daughter who got him on a whim, with no idea of the work and time a dog requires. So his world is a 20-foot chain. When he sees me coming down the forest path from our place, he flings to the end of his chain, rears up, paws the ear, flattens his ears in welcome. I've never known a creature with so much love to give. When I get closer, he twirls and dances, and then I brace myself for 120 pounds of mostly Malamute to slam my chest and lick my face. I've never known a creature to whom a hug meant so much. We played for a while, but I have places to be. When I leave, he sits and stares till I am out of sight, and his world returns to 20 feet of chain. East and west and south and north, 20 feet of chain, 20 feet. I wish there was something I could do. I'm going to do one more, and then take the questions. And I've got a particular one I want to do. I've been mixing and matching, so I started out with these in order. They are so far out of order. I'm going to read two. By the way, if any of you are teachers or trainers, I know you're never allowed to turn your back. I'm just doing it for a minute. I do. Well, if I can't find the one I want, I find another one that I want to read. So, I'm choosing this one because when I read at my local high school, this was their favorite. I was amazed. I had no idea this would go over so well. And this one is about our cat. We have a cat. My wife and I have a difference of opinion about the cat's gender. She says it's female. I say it's male. The vet agrees with her, but what does the vet know? And she gave the cat the most icky name that you can possibly imagine. So I had to give it the most macho name I could think of, just to balance the scales. She calls it Pretty Girl, which just makes me want to barf. So his real name is Chopper. And his poem about Chopper. The cat has grown, and I chose this to read in Nashville because once again, I was on my high horse that a poem should have some wit involved, and so few do. And this one I think has a little. The cat has grown so ridiculously huge, I call him the family lynx. And when I cuddle him to my chest, he purrs like a turbine, and and delicately inserts 4 curved claws into my skin. Could you find another way to show your love? I ask, and pull his claws out of my body. He slowly squints in ecstasy, moves his paw an inch, and digs 4 new holes. I say to my wife, hand sanitizer, please, and reflect and wonder if, in my love, I have done such hurtful things, just because we all act in our nature, and I could do no other.
Auntie, did you ever write poetry for your children?
No, not exactly.
About them?
We used to have, we have had making up stories and stuff, and I loved reading to them, but I haven't actually written poems. I made up a couple of songs that I used to sing to them, but I'm not doing that here. I'll tell you what, for my last poem, I'm going to read the only one that I decided would probably not be appropriate at high school. And I'm also choosing it because of all the things that concern people, the one that poets seem to write about least is money. And yet they obsess about it as much as anybody else. But it's like too crass to write about. So this is a poem about money. And I thought it came out okay, I really did. It's called The Housekeeper. And it takes place in Comfort Inn in Scottsbluff, Nebraska. And there's one term in it that might not be familiar to everybody, and that is, I'm referring to a person called the head, and that stands for the head housekeeper. Okay? I change the sheets where the lovers tossed, the stained sheets, and vacuum, and do the toilets, and refresh the paper goods. Whichever floor the head assigns me to. They're all the same, although we have a superstition that the top floors tip better. That's silly, but I can tell you this, men tip better. The head, she takes $20 from us every Friday, or we get fired. Carmela got fired when her mother was sick, and she had to have the money for medicine. Her boyfriend cut the head's tires. It didn't get her job back, but it must have felt good. My feet hurt all the time. I want to sit. I'm tired. I want a cup of coffee. And if you put a shot of rum in it, I wouldn't say no. I want a jackpot. Mirella had a room last week, so tidy it could have been unused, and the gentleman left her $100. We went to her place with some good wine, and she said, for that he could have had me too. And we laughed so hard I almost peed. But she's got a bad name, and anyway, a classy guy like that wouldn't want on the Hikana housekeeper. After all, it's not bad, this job. I make ends meet and go home once a year. But that's the best I can do. I couldn't go home last month when my brother died. And oh, if I had the money, I bet there's something they could do for my feet. So that's a cross-section of me and my life. I read a little longer than I was supposed to. But we got some time left over. I hope you have some questions. Comments? Okay, it's time to wake up. So,
Okay, was that one about the squirrel and the chain, did that actually happen?
the stock answer is there's a continuum. So, most of my poems tell some kind of story, because I like poems better that do that, rather than just preach. I'd rather make a point, I'd rather tell a story with a point in it than just give the point. And sometimes they're entirely factual, and sometimes there's not a drop of truth in them. And more often there's somewhere in the middle, where I'll take some kind of event and write it up. And if I need to change it to make it a better poem, I will. And I call it poetic license, not lying. But either would do. So I want to answer your question specifically.
So how do we get people interested in poetry in America?
I don't know. I think what we need is someone to do for poetry what Muhammad Ali did for boxing 40 years ago. To just be not only really good at the craft, but charismatic too, able to think on their feet. I don't know.
Is poetry still taught in schools?
Yes. And you know what surprised me when I looked at the books at Lincoln Academy? It's the same poets that they were teaching when I was in school, which to me corroborates my belief that the stuff that's being written right now is not good. No.
So, Andy, what provokes you to write a book? No, let me rephrase that. Do you get, are you somewhere and an image strikes you or an event occurs and you immediately, haul out a piece of tissue paper and scribble on your hand? Does it percolate? Does it get invested with other events and then it comes out as a poem? Just talk about the process a little bit.
You make it sound so much better than it really is.
Yeah.
I wish it was like that, but what it really is, gosh, I don't even like to admit this. What it really is I'll have a stern talk with myself and I'll say, Hubbard, it's been 10 days since you wrote a damn thing. You will sit down in this chair, you will duct tape yourself to it, and you will not get up until you write something. Do you hear me? And Hubbard says, sir, yes, sir. And I'll sit down and pick up the pen. Sometimes something comes out, sometimes it doesn't. More often than not, something comes out, and then I'll write it. I write almost all of my poems in one sitting, and then I got to evaluate it, and it makes the cut or it doesn't. If it doesn't make the cut, it goes straight in the wastebasket. If it makes the cut, then I go over it. By the time I'm sick to death of it, it's as good as I can get it.
Has your reason for writing poetry changed since we were classmates at Lincoln back in the 60s?
No, say it ain't so.
Had to throw that in? Because you wrote a lot then.
Yeah, and I write more now, and to the best of my ability as a self-critic, I get better and better. And I don't know, it's kind of how I define myself. I couldn't not do it, okay? But I don't really have a good reason. And now I'm diligently pursuing fame and fortune. And the real reason is I don't want fame at all, and I don't need a lot of fortune. What I want is validation. I say I'm as good as the best writing poetry in English today, and I want to prove that with sales or something. I want to do Carnegie Hall.
Andy, what stands out with your day at Lincoln Academy?
People hug. When I was in high school, you'd have gotten kicked out for hugging somebody. And when I first saw the hugging going on in Nashville High School, first I was shocked, and then when I reflected on it, I said, we're a sociable species. Hugging's a good thing. So I think it's an improvement. That's the first thing that I think of. People hugging. It's a good thing to do.
I liked your comment about the chimpanzee observing that humans don't touch each other much.
Yeah, true, especially in New England. And especially the ethnic mix that most of us in this room are of Northern Europeans. When my first wife was doing her practice teaching in a mixed ethnic community in Springfield, Massachusetts, the thing that shocked her was the family was always touching each other, always sitting in laps, always holding each other, always, all day long. And my reaction was, that's a good thing. We got to try it. We should do more about it. But it's not in the culture that I was raised in. In fact, there's an old Maine joke. I apologize if you've heard it before, but a guy goes to his wife's funeral, and a neighbor comes over to him and says, she was a good woman. And he says, yeah, sometimes it was all I could do to keep from telling her so. If that's not Maine, I don't know what it is.
How about heavy poems, like The Second Coming? You know,
Sure, turning and turning into widening gyre. Right? So it's, yeah. Yeats is one of my favorites, and that's one of my favorite poems of Yeats. But I'm not sure what the question means. What do you mean, how about it?
Well,
cool.
how do you feel about writing something as heavy and somber and portentous as that poem is?
I would like to think that I can write something as deep as that, but if possible, I would prefer not to be as somber as that. I'll tell you what, will you give me a minute to find the poem I was looking for before? Because it's on this table somewhere. And it's a good example of a perfectly miserable situation. It's on the bottom. But it doesn't have to be completely grim. It can be grim in content without being grim in form. Okay? I started out by saying few of my poems are about something with a capital A. The Squirrel and the Wind Chimes was, and this is. And I think this is maybe the best poem I've written. It's very recent, and it's about a question. And the question is, how do you deal with four things: desolation, despair, pain, and poverty? How do you deal with that? And the narrator of this poem has his answer, which I'll share with you. And this will be a good place to start too, I think. It's called Jokes and Rules. I haven't filed taxes in 8 years. IRS come after me 4 years ago and decided I just wasn't worth the trouble. Funny. Almost exactly the same words my wife said when she left. I live in Freehold, Ohio. Once a strong little steel town. Now the joke is that the best job is selling plywood to board up the storefronts. Hope should be free, and I guess it is. But the other joke is, hope's like money, but we don't got much of. I spend my days at Sandy's bar, and my check too. I call it social insecurity. It comes about the 18th, and I make it a rule, never to cash it until it arrives. That's a joke. Sandy's opens at 11, and I'm there, freshly shaven, and in clean clothes. That's 2 of my rules. A man's got to have his rules. Sandy's has 2 pinball machines, 1 works, a bowling game, a pool table, and 14 stools. It's been open for over 100 years, and it looks it. The walls are aged black. The floor is worn concave behind the stools, where guys have walked to the bathroom since 1900 or thereabouts. I have my own stool at the end with a cushion because of my back. Sandy's mother made it for me. She's 94 and in better shape than I am. By 68, a man gets to know about every kind of pain there is. And I want to tell you, ruptured discs is the worst. Some mornings I sit on the edge of the bed 15 minutes, getting the courage to try to stand. I start my day with a big Bud Light draft. I won't touch the hard stuff before 3 p.m. The man's got to have his rules. Sandy and I have a joke that I have to make it last until the noon rush, and I do. The noon rush comes in at 12 sharp, both of them. Albert and Beverly, 2 biggish black guys, gentle as doves, both bald with huge, thick hands. They could almost be twins. Sandy sets up the beers, and the day gets going. We may shoot some pool. We may talk about the women and the jobs that have come and gone. We may watch the weather out the windows, watch the light change from afternoon to evening to dark. If nobody else comes in, Sandy says he'd like to close up early and gives us a shot on the house. I like him a lot. He gives me credit till my check comes in and laughs like he means it when we tell him he needs us as much as we need him. Back home it's a rule. Sitting on the toilet, I always drink a glass of water and take 2 aspirin. A man's got to have his rules. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much for coming. This is, I like to think what I do best, and I've had a great time the past hour with you folks, and hope you enjoyed it, gotten something out of it. So
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Thanks.
You were free.